May 1942. The Australians' fears to be invaded by Japanese forces are strengthened when the latter reach the vicinity of the Timor Sea. A large portion of their troops is fighting along with the rest of the Allies in North Africa, thus weakening their capacity to repel a Japanese assault. Nevertheless, the air raids over Japan, performed by planes under Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, had improved the Australians' as well as the Americans' spirit. Moreover, the Japanese had been forced to withdraw some fighter squadrons to protect the skies over their main cities. But their belief in their own invulnerability makes them launch a hasty reaction. The Japanese response is not long in coming. Operation M.O., under the command of Vice Admiral Shigeyoshi Inoue, is got underway. A part of the fleet, comprised of transport ships escorted by destroyers, sets course along the coast of Papua New Guinea, heading for the Jormard Canal. Its objective is the capital, Port Moresby, in the Gulf of Papua. Other units are charged with taking Talugi in the Solomon Islands and the Louisade Archipelago, where they are to quickly establish a base for hydroplanes and an airfield. Five cruisers, a destroyer, and the aircraft carrier Shoho, commanded by Rear Admiral Goto, are to provide air and naval cover for these actions. The aircraft carriers Shokaku and Zikaku, which were involved in the Pearl Harbor and Ceylon actions, under the command of Rear Admiral Chuchihara, will take part in the attack. They are to repulse any action of the U.S. fleet. But both Chester Nimitz, the commander-in-chief of the Pacific Fleet, and Douglas MacArthur, in charge of the troops in the Southwest Pacific, know what the Japanese objective is and are well aware of its importance as a base guaranteeing the security of Australia. Together with their general staff, they prepare a defensive strategy based on an aerial counteroffensive and order the Yorktown and the Lexington, together with the destroyers and cruisers under Admiral Fletcher, to set sail. The Enterprise and the Hornet cannot be incorporated into the operations, as they are returning from their raid on Japan. On May the 2nd, Admiral Nimitz makes his first visit to the Midway Island facilities. The American military intelligence has been for a long time predicting that the new Japanese thrust would be aimed to this strategically located island and not to Hawaii or the United States West Coast. Nimitz is relying on the information provided by Lieutenant Commander Joseph Roquefort, in charge of the Hawaii Information Station. Data extracted from taped Japanese messages point out that the Imperial Fleet is coordinating a great operation that will almost certainly be aimed against Midway Island. The American admiral attends a meeting with the Navy base commanders, Captain Shannon and Cyril Simard, in order to arrange for the island's defense, placed under his personal supervision to repel the Japanese amphibian assault. On the 3rd of May, Fletcher receives the message that the Japanese have disembarked on Tulagi and occupied part of the Solomon Islands. He immediately orders his ships to set a course at full speed for the islands. When the Yorktown is less than 20 miles from the invaders, the torpedo planes take off and begin an attack on the Japanese ships that have stayed to provide naval cover, sinking a destroyer and 3 minesweepers. Immediately afterwards, the U.S. ships regroup and turn south in an attempt to intercept the remaining Japanese ships, which have entered the Coral Sea and launched their planes in a first attack on Port Moresby. The U.S. aircraft, in an attempt to head off the invasion, attack near the Jormard Canal. Meanwhile, the Lexington sights the aircraft carrier Shoho, together with a number of destroyers and cruisers to the south of Bougainville, and its pilots submit the Japanese ship to heavy bombing until they are able to sink it. The Zuikaku and the Shokaku, having picked up the call for help, sail at full steam to where a part of the fleet is under attack. The ships of Admirals Tagaki and those of Fletcher are only 60 miles from each other, though neither side knows this due to the bad weather. In the early hours of the 8th, almost simultaneously, the reconnaissance planes of both sides spot the enemy ships. Planes take off from aircraft carriers in continuous attacks at a distance from which one side cannot see the other. The Shokaku and the Zuikaku are put out of action, as is the Yorktown, while the Lexington is sunk. The unusual nature of the battle and the lack of information on both sides leads the respective commands to take precautions and order their ships to withdraw to their bases. The first battle in history in which only aircraft carriers have taken part has resulted in a first reverse for the Japanese. The conquest of Port Moresby has not gone ahead, and Operation MO has turned into a failure for Yamamoto. The aircraft carriers Enterprise and Hornet, which did not arrive in time to help Fletcher, anchor in Pearl Harbor with a view to carrying out checks and stocking up on supplies. Some days later, the Yorktown arrives at the port to undertake urgent repairs. Following these events, the Japanese General Staff unanimously approves the plan to invade Midway. Admiral Osami Nagano, Chief of the General Staff, and Isoroku Yamamoto decide that the operation should comprise a surprise attack similar to that on Pearl Harbor. Both are convinced that the lightly defended island can be rapidly conquered. The Air Force is to attack first. Then, the naval artillery will enter into action, and this will be followed by the disembarkation of the troops who are to occupy the U.S. positions. The victory should be quick and conclusive. The bulk of the Imperial fleet is to remain at some distance to provide protection against any counterattack by the U.S. fleet. The planned attack on the Aleutian Islands of Attu and Kiska is to go ahead at the end of May or beginning of June as a diversionary measure. The idea is to attract the attention of the bulk of the Pacific Fleet and to facilitate the rapid attack on Midway on June the 3rd, the date set by Yamamoto. The mighty admiral is the mind behind the Midway plan. Feeling a blind faith in victory, he decides to sail in one of the ships engaging in battle. Some chiefs blame him for this and suggest that he should keep to Hashirajima, from which point he will be in a better position to lead the troops. Day 20. The American intelligence services know that the Japanese are planning a new operation for the end of the month, as they have intercepted a number of messages in which the Japanese designate the objective with the letters AF. In some doubt regarding which of the islands AF refers to, the Americans send a message to the commander of Midway informing him that, in response to his problems with water, they are going to send the necessary distillation equipment. Next day, they intercept a Japanese message saying, "To all operational forces, point AF does not have fresh water." The incognito has been cleared up. The objective is Midway. Day 25. The 5th Task Force of Aircraft Carriers under Vice Admiral Boshiro Hosogawa and the light carriers Rijo and Junyo set sail together with the heavy cruisers Maya and Takao from the base at Ominato to the north of Honshu in the direction of the Aleutian Islands. They are supported by the battleships Ise, Fuso, and Yamashiro, plus the cruiser Abukuma and a number of transport ships with 1,200 soldiers. Shortly afterwards, the first task force of aircraft carriers, composed of the Akagi and the Kaga, under the command of the Emperor's cousin, Admiral Chiuchi Nagumo, and the second task force, consisting of the Hiryu and the Soryu, commanded by Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, set sail from Hashirajima. Their destination is a point near the Midway Atoll. Day 28. Yamamoto's first fleet, formed by the battleships Yamato, Nagato, and Mutsu, together with the aircraft carriers Hosho and the cruiser Sendai, plus 12 destroyers, set sail for a location at some distance from Midway, where they will follow the course of the battle. The admiral is convinced that the Americans know nothing of the operation. Nevertheless, he orders continuous reconnaissance flights and sends some of the fleet's largest submarines to strategic points to keep a lookout. With the significant advantage of knowing the Japanese plans, the Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, Admiral Chester Nimitz, prepares his tactics. He knows he cannot afford to lose the base at Midway, as this would undermine his ability to carry out long-range bombing. Both he and Roosevelt are prepared to make a stand at Midway, with a view to putting a definitive halt to Japanese ambitions. Inflicting a heavy defeat on the enemy would change the course of the war and open up the possibility of starting a large-scale counter-offensive. The U.S. Admiral personally travels to the island to take control of its defenses. He reinforces the number of planes and soldiers in the garrison under Harold Shannon and orders the installation of a direct telephone line with the command post in Honolulu to avoid, as far as possible, using the radio. Despite knowing the Japanese plans and having the Yorktown operational again after repairs, Nimitz fears the enormous superiority of the Imperial fleet against his 3 aircraft carriers. The only barrier between the Japanese fleet and the coasts of the United States are these 3 aircraft carriers, he warns President Roosevelt. The American forces' target is quite clear. The first surprise attack must be aimed against the 4 Imperial fleet's carriers. Strike and withdraw at once is the order. Should the Imperial fleet sink the American Navy's carriers, all the Pacific area and the country's west coast would undergo the consequences. Nimitz asks Admirals Frank Fletcher and Raymond Spruance to accurately assess the risks and engage the Japanese fleet only when being positively sure of a victory. The Hornet and the Enterprise, together with their respective auxiliary ships, head out to sea escorted by 6 cruisers and 9 destroyers. The remainder of the operational force formed by the Yorktown, 8 cruisers, 15 destroyers, and 20 submarines under Admiral Fletcher sail to their positions of combat. Day 31. On the night of the 31st of May, Task Force 16, commanded by Admiral Raymond Spruance and formed by the aircraft carriers Hornet and Enterprise, together with Task Force 17 under Admiral Frank Fletcher, which includes the aircraft carrier Yorktown silently head for Point Luck, situated 300 miles to the northeast of Midway. They have crossed French frigate shoals and the Japanese security barrier without being detected. The 29 reconnaissance submarines of the Imperial Fleet, spread out over the Pacific, have arrived late to their observation points and have not been able to detect the movements of the U.S. ships. June, Day 2. Nimitz maintains aerial vigilance with PBY Catalina planes, continually scouring a wide area of 750 miles northwest to southwest of Midway. Nothing to be seen. All is quiet, and there is no sign of the enemy. Further north, as foreseen, the Japanese have attacked the islands of Attu and Kiska without meeting resistance, destroying the installations and fuel deposits at Dutch Harbor. To trick Yamamoto into believing that the first phase of his plan has been successful, 5 cruisers and 10 destroyers are sent to the Aleutian Islands to repel the Japanese attack. Day 3. Chiuchi Nagumo, the hero of Pearl Harbor, and his fleet approach the position of attack. The admiral orders a number of squadrons of planes to take off from the Agagi and Mikuma and the Tone on reconnaissance missions. The planes from the Agagi are to search a radius of 300 miles in the southern sector. The remainder of the area under observation is the responsibility of the planes that have taken off from the other ships after some delays. In the early hours of the morning, Jewel Reed, a pilot of one of the Catalina reconnaissance planes from the Pacific Fleet, informs his command post of the sighting of at least 11 Japanese ships sailing some 600 miles to the west of Midway in the direction of the island. Nimitz orders 10 B-17 planes to take off from the U.S. base and carry out high-altitude bombing of the Japanese ships. He analyzes the situation with his commanders and, concluding that the force spotted by the PBY cannot be the main body of the Japanese attack, he orders the reconnaissance planes to continue their search. The Japanese offensive could come from any point in a range of approximately 180 degrees northwest-southwest, he warns. The U.S. ships, situated to the northwest of Midway, head for a position 200 miles to the north of the island. A state of maximum alert is declared, and the tension increases among the men of the U.S. fleet, though there is no sign of the enemy. Day 4, 4:30 local time. The number of reconnaissance planes from both fleets increases. 10 Dauntless dive bombers take off from the Yorktown to cover the area of the first 100 miles northwest-southwest. The remainder, up to 300 miles, falls to the PBY Catalina planes. The Japanese, meanwhile, send 2 fighter bombers from the Agagi and the Kaga, and 2 hydroplanes from the Tone and the Shikuma. The tone plane has problems, and its takeoff is delayed. This will be fateful for the Japanese fleet. The main body of the Imperial fleet under Nagumo, with 165 ships, including 8 aircraft carriers, sails to the northwest of Midway in direction of the limit of 200 miles. Of the 234 warplanes on the Hiryu, Agaji, Soryu, and Kaga, 108 Kate, Val, and Zero models are being prepared on the decks. These will form the first wave of the attack on Midway. The pilots, under the command of Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, board their planes to the cry of "Banzai, Banzai," and begin to take off under the watchful eyes of Nagumo, situated in his command post on the aircraft carrier Akaji. The Japanese pilots fly off in the direction of their objective, confident they are carrying out another surprise attack similar to that on Pearl Harbor. They do not expect much opposition from the Americans. Five o'clock local time. The crew of the Akaji spots an enemy Catalina on a reconnaissance flight. The Zeros go after it, but are unable to shoot it down. The American pilot has managed to give them the slip, hiding amid the clouds. The PBY informs Fletcher's fleet by radio that enemy aircraft carriers are at 200 miles northwest of Midway. A few minutes later, a new message comes in from another reconnaissance plane. Enemy planes flying towards Midway. The planes stationed on Midway take off in search of the Japanese ships and aircraft. Meanwhile, 250 miles to the northeast of the island, U.S. Task Forces 16 and 17 prepare for battle. Fletcher and Spruance can count on the Yorktown, the Hornet, and the Enterprise to take on the enormous naval force of the Imperial Japanese Navy. The Battle of Midway, one of the most decisive of the Second World War, has begun. 6:30 local time. When the first wave of Japanese Zeros reaches Midway, it is met by old buffaloes in the hands of inexperienced pilots, which are easily brought down. But the island's anti-aircraft guns shoot down most of the Japanese planes. Seven o'clock local time. The bombers are clustered on the decks of the 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, ready to attack Midway again. In some cases, their bombs have been changed for torpedoes by order of Admiral Nagumo, who is certain that the fleet situated in Pearl Harbor will come to the aid of the troops on the island. However, his surprise increases when he learns that the Japanese submarines still haven't reported sighting enemy ships. While the Japanese commanders are trying to clear up their doubts, B-17 bombers arrive escorted by Avengers. The intense artillery fire from the aircraft carriers and the rapid intervention of the Zeros result in the shooting down of 10 U.S. planes and failure of the attack. (7:15 local time). The lack of news from the submarines watching the movements of the Pearl Harbor fleet continues to perturb the Japanese admiral. If the U.S. ships have not been sighted, it means that there is time for his planes to pound Midway, and he orders them to be loaded once more with bombs. Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, commanding the aircraft carriers Hiryu and Soryu, does not comply with the order, however, which he considers to be mistaken, and tells his pilots not to change the munitions of their planes. (7:30 local time). The Japanese reconnaissance planes report sightings of U.S. warships 200 miles northeast of Midway. Nagumo is nervous. He orders a halt to the change of munitions and for the planes to be once more loaded with torpedoes, which generates a great deal of confusion among the pilots and crews of the respective aircraft carriers. Tamaguchi, for his part, decides that the Hiryu's and the Soryu's planes should take off in search of the U.S. ships. (8:00 local time). The Japanese ships come under attack again from Dauntless and Vindicator warplanes, and B-17 bombers dropping their bombs rather inaccurately from high altitude. (8:15 local time). No Japanese ship has suffered serious damage, and the messages of the reconnaissance planes confirm there are no enemy aircraft carriers. Nagumo believes he has regained the initiative and orders all his forces to attack the island and the U.S. ships that have been sighted. (8:35 local time). On the Japanese flagship, an urgent message now comes through from the Tone's delayed reconnaissance plane. Enemy aircraft carrier sighted. The Akashi's command post falls silent. Nagumo cannot believe his ears. The submarines and reconnaissance planes have failed. 9:30 local time. The ship that has been spotted is the Yorktown, which the Japanese believed had disappeared, and which now launches its planes in successive waves in search of Japanese ships. At the same time, the Enterprise and the Hornet approach the Japanese fleet. The artillery and the Zeros respond with force against the U.S. planes sent by Fletcher, shooting down most of them. 10:15 local time. The Japanese commanders celebrate the air victory over the enemy, though Nagumo fears there is another U.S. aircraft carrier in the area. 10:30 local time. He is not wrong. A new wave of dauntless bombers from the Enterprise and the Hornet launched their bombs from high altitude on the Akaji, the Kaga, and the Soryu. They meet little aerial resistance, as many of the Japanese planes are flying in the direction of Midway or searching for the U.S. fleet. Those that have remained in reserve to provide air cover are refueling and being loaded with explosives. Only a few manage to take off before the arrival of the enemy planes, but are unable to reach the altitude necessary to enter into combat. The Akaji is hit by a number of bombs which explode close to badly stowed munitions, causing a chain of explosions which destroys the fuel deposits and the planes on the deck. The Japanese ship is transformed into an inferno, which engulfs those crew members who have not been able to throw themselves into the sea. Four bombs hit the Kaga, destroying its prow, and the command post where the ship's commander, Isaku Okada, loses his life. The Soryu is hit by 3 bombs and begins to sink. Its commander, Risaku Yangimoto, remains at his post as his ship goes down. In a few minutes, a handful of American pilots have eliminated 3 Japanese aircraft carriers. Only one remains, the Hiryu, which is situated further to the northeast and hidden in the mist. Yamamoto, on board the battleship Yamato, receives news of the disaster. He knows Nagumo has survived the attack and orders his immediate substitution. (2:40 local time). The audacious Yamaguchi, having witnessed events, orders an attack from the Hiryu against the American aircraft carriers. His Zeros, Vals, and Kate's warplanes try to snatch the victory from the U.S. ships. The Yorktown detects the arrival of the Japanese planes and scrambles its Wildcats. But the Japanese pilots score 3 hits that destroy the ship's stern, prow, and boilers. Yamaguchi receives the news that the Yorktown has been hit and is leaking badly. He decides on a 3rd wave to finish off the enemy aircraft carrier. "5 o'clock local time. The air attacks from the Hiryu have given away the position of the ship to the Americans, and the dauntless warplanes from the hidden Enterprise now attack the Japanese aircraft carrier, engaging in furious air fights with the Zeros, which desperately attempt to provide air cover, while the vessel tries to evade the bombs with continual changes of course at full speed. But 4 direct hits on the bridge and the deck turn the Hiryu into an inferno impossible to control. Day 5. The battleships Haruna and Kirishima go to its aid, but with little success. And at 2 in the morning, the Japanese aircraft carrier suffers an enormous explosion, which sends it to the bottom of the sea some hours later. Yamaguchi goes down with the ship together with a number of crew members who refuse to abandon their posts. A desperate Yamamoto seeks the definitive confrontation that he so much wants, and orders a counterattack by all available forces. But Nimitz has decided to withdraw his ships to the north. Day 6. The commander-in-chief of the Imperial fleet urgently needs a victory and orders his cruisers to attack the island of Midway in order to prepare the way for troop landings. However, Vice Admiral Ugaki manages to dissuade him from this course of action, given that, at this stage of the battle, it would be suicide. At midday, Yamamoto orders a general withdrawal. Day 7. At 6 in the morning, due to the damage caused by torpedoes from the Japanese submarine I-168, The Yorktown goes down together with the destroyer Haman, which had come to its aid. But Japan has suffered the worst naval disaster of her history, and the Battle of Midway has changed the course of the war. The Americans have lost the aircraft carrier Yorktown and the destroyer Hammond, 155 planes and 260 men. The Japanese have suffered the loss of the aircraft carriers Agaji, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu, as well as the cruisers Mikuma, 250 planes, and 3,100 men. The collapse of the offensive capacity of Japan's air and sea forces is evident. The government imposes censorship on war-related news in the press, and Admiral Yamamoto is pushed into the background. 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the Admiral's plan has resulted in a complete failure for the Japanese Empire. Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki, bowed before the Emperor, admits that the defeat has been the fruit of arrogance. We have been vainglorious due to the previous successes. For the United States, the importance of aircraft carriers in the struggle to reclaim supremacy in the Pacific has been clearly demonstrated. The key to success has been information. This memorable victory, at one stroke, changed the dominant position of Japan in the Pacific. From their bases in Papua New Guinea, the Japanese threaten Australia, which lives in fear of an imminent invasion. To reinforce the country's defenses, MacArthur requests arms and men from Roosevelt. These arrive in large numbers in convoys across the Pacific. In June, the Battle of Midway was a great blow for the Imperial Navy, which forced the Japanese to suspend the assault on the Fiji Islands, Samoa, and New Caledonia, and consolidate the defensive perimeter around Papua New Guinea, the Bismarck, and the Solomon Islands. But the proximity of the Allied base at Port Moresby poses a grave danger and threatens Japanese plans. Its existence places restrictions on the movements of Japanese troops, and it becomes an important objective. To take it, it is necessary to have aerial support from a nearby base, and the most suitable place is Guadalcanal.